Hello, everyone, and welcome again to a Climate Emergency Centre webinar and discussion, and getting people together from all over the country to see what we can do to help people and planet. We're very honoured tonight to have Natalie Bennett, who is a Trojan and a bit of a legend of the Green Movement, who leader of the Green Party 2012 to 2016. And she's come to tell us about, talk a bit about the Green Movement and the recent success. We are all so happy for MPs have joined the Green team, and hope a lot more change can happen from that and more other years. But she's also going to talk about a new book, which is called Change Everything, how we can rethink, repair and rebuild society. And seeing as the Climate Emergency Centre is about getting solutions out on the high street, those are three very important things we need to work on and talk about. So get a copy of the book. Over to you, Natalie. Thank you so much for coming. Tell us over.
You very much, and thank you everyone for coming along. And I was trying to count how many climate centres I've visited over the years, and it must be at least 4 or 5. But there's probably a few that I've kind of slid into my background. So as a movement, I think it's great, and I'm always encountering people and suggesting maybe that's something what they could do in their town or city. So it's particularly great to be with you. So you asked me, Phoenix, first of all, to talk a little bit about the election, and I kind of imagine everyone on this call knows that we targeted 4 seats in the Green Party. In our first past the post electoral system, we have no choice but to focus a huge amount of our resources and efforts on a relatively small number of seats, and that's what we did. And it's interesting because on the election night about 12:30 a.m. I was in the Radio 4 studio, and Lord Kinnock was there, and at that stage all the polls were only predicting us to get 2, but I'd already had little birds whispering in my ear saying there was a good chance we were going to win also both Waveney Valley and Herefordshire North. And so he said to me, "Oh, you're only going to get 2," and I said, no, I'm confident we're going to get 4. And he kind of looked at me like I was slightly mad. So, I'm hoping to run into him again sometime soon. But it's a real demonstration of that we had a target, we set the target and we achieved it. But this is only very much a step along the way. And of course, for the Green Party, the next thing coming up is the county council elections next May. And everyone's very much focused, pivoting towards those. Probably people have seen the graph of the number of Green councillors over the last 5 years. It's essentially increased 5-fold. The graph is a graph of exponential growth going up at that kind of angle. And I think what we need to perhaps understand and think about is that if you go from 1 MP to 4 MP, you're starting on the same kind of trajectory. And that's very much, what I'm perceiving, what the Green Party's perceiving. We've got to obviously assess where things are, reassess everything. But before this election happened, it said the election after this, the target would be at least 30 seats. And if you start to imagine what that looks like around the country, that looks, like a very different kind of scale. But I think probably sort of going to broader perspective, and I noticed a couple of people commenting on the need for hope. And one of the things that change everything, I'll wave it round at this point, it's very green. One of the things that lots of people have said is, if you haven't got a green poster and there's an election on, you can just stick this in your window and it looks like a vote green poster anyway. But the way in which political change happens, and when I first joined the Green Party in 2006, and that was it was a New Year's resolution, 1st of January. Yes, I might have been a titsy bit hungover, but I just stopped working nights, and I thought, I'm really worried about the state of the world. I want to do something, and I'm going to join something. And I thought about Greenpeace, I thought about War on Want, I thought about organisations like that. But ultimately, I thought where the decisions are made is in local councils, is in Westminster. It was then, sadly not now, but was in Brussels. And we've got to stop electing the wrong people and hoping they'll do the right things. And I think it very much felt then the model was that NGOs and campaigners, they all were like, oh, we can't get too close to the Green Party because we've got to work with whoever is in power. And we're just going to have those people in power forever. And that's the way it is. And I think what's very evident now is that political change doesn't happen slowly and gradually. It happens in big jumps. And the last real change in British politics was the election of Margaret Thatcher. After Thatcher, Blair was the child of Thatcher. Cameron was the child of Blair. I don't quite know where one puts Boris Johnson, but let's park that one to the side slightly, but let alone Liz Truss. But nonetheless, we've had a political frame that said greed is good, inequality doesn't matter, and we can keep trashing the planet. And actually, if you look back to the 40 years before Thatcher, the Second World War consensus, there was actually a reduction, slow but steady, in inequality. But there was no understanding then, and it would have been harder to see, but there was no understanding then that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And it was essentially all still built on trashing the planet, on treating the planet as a mine and a dumping ground. So we've had those two patterns of social democratic consensus, neoliberal consensus, and the neoliberal consensus is broken down now, and we are now constructing what's likely to be the politics for the next 40 years. And people who are looking for hope, I'd put in the key message of hope is where we are now is profoundly unstable. We are both trashing the planet and creating a thoroughly unhealthy, unequal, unhappy society. And this is not going to stay the same. Things are going to change. And that's a moment of great possibility. I mean, if I think back to 2006 when I joined the Green Party, and a couple of weeks later, I was knocking on my first doors. It was really tough campaigning for the Green Party. It was really tough campaigning for change then, because people would, metaphorically speaking, sit back in their armchairs and go, well, Gordon Brown has abolished boom and bust. You might remember that. There was the Mansion House speech where he said, we'll all be fine. We'll just ride into the future, happily progressing forward on all those smart people in the City of London. And we can just all ride on that and not worry about anything else. And, people believed that, understood that, thought that was the way it was. And it was actually saying to people, we're going to have to change things. People would go, oh, well, we know the grandkids or maybe the great grandkids will have to worry about the climate emergency, but that's so far in the future and we'll have so much money that it'll all be fine. Whereas now practically nobody believes that we are where we are now is stable. Educationally, you look at the state of our universities, the fact we're loading down our young people with enormous amounts of debt that they're never going to be able to repay. The whole thing is actually, the whole system is a fiction. Something like 70 to 80% of the people with those debts are never going to pay them off. They're not really loans at all. They're just a great fiction. And so much of what we're at now is like that. So it's actually so much easier to campaign, and there's so much more possibilities for campaigning now than there was in 2006, because there's a survey which has been done over quite a number of years asking people, do you think your kids and grandkids will have a better life than you? And it's basically overwhelmingly now increasingly negative. People get in their gut that the system's broken and it needs to change. And one of the things that I like to point to is, in the last year or so, everyone's got all the media outlets, all the political parties pretty well have got terribly exercised about what our privatised water companies are doing to our rivers. But it's interesting that if you go back in the Financial Times, they actually have a page about water companies of all the stories. And it was actually 4 or 5 years ago that they started to say, oh, there's a real problem here with the way we've loaded down these water companies with debt. And it's all based on the basis that interest rates will stay really low. What's going to happen if interest rates go up? And, the FT is the kind of intelligent end of the current system. And I think they spotted some years ago that the current system was falling apart. And I've got a little theory that actually the FT is going to be the first national newspaper to advocate vote Green in a general election in its columns, because they can actually see the current system is broken and it cannot work. So we have the moment now where we can build the change. And I think one of the things that I've actually just been thinking quite a lot about is the first verb in the title of Change Everything, how we can rethink our society. And if we're thinking about systems of change, one of the things we have to do is to be able to think that it's possible for things to be different. And one of the chief challenges I think that we have as part of the small g green movement, whatever part or whatever role you might play, is to actually restore people's hope that politics can change things. And there was actually the University of Northumbria did a fascinating study on universal basic income, which is something I'm a long-term champion of. And in fact, the first chapter of the book is about UBI, and I'll come back to universal basic income. But University of Northumbria did this study on UBI and explained to people this is a payment that goes to everyone every month to meet their basic needs, and no one is left being able to put food on the table, keep a roof over their head. What do you think about this? And they got a whole lot of quote unquote ordinary people who weren't at all into politics into a room and asked them that. And overwhelmingly, the people said, yeah, it sounds like a great idea. Yeah, we really like that idea. But it's not going to happen because politics never changes anything. And if there's one thing we have to achieve, is we have to convince people that it's possible to use politics to change things. Now, what do I mean by politics? Well, as a starting point, I would say that we need a world in which everyone makes politics what they do, not have done to them. And that is, a very fundamental form of system change. And politics, by my definition, is getting together with your friends, your classmates, your work colleagues, your neighbors, other people in your town, other people around the world who share the interests with you, and working together to improve things, whatever it is that you're concerned about. So I often go into schools and, I say, well, you can start doing politics here in the school. Think about as a class or a group, what don't you like about the school, and start a campaign to change it. At which point the teacher who invited me kind of goes, oh God, what have I done? But it's organising a campaign to get less plastic in the school canteen. That's politics. Organising a litter pick in your street so the street's nicer, and perhaps planting some nice bit of guerrilla gardening with a few bulbs afterwards. That's politics. And we've got to re-empower people to understand that they can actually make a difference. And that, I think, is really crucial. And that rethinking is foundational. And actually, just because I've been thinking about this a lot, been reading a bit about artificial intelligence, and I actually just put a piece in Yorkshire Bylines reflecting a speech I gave to the local government chronicle very carefully, non-politically, during the election, and was saying, lots of people are marching around at the moment saying, whatever the problem is, artificial intelligence will provide the solution. Well, let's be very, very skeptical about that. And something I've been reading lately makes a very interesting point, that the problem with AI, or the generative kind of AI that everyone's getting very excited about, ChatGPT and everything, that is actually only reflecting the past. It only can reflect the past. It does not come up with a single original idea, a single original formulation. All it does is reflecting our past back to us. And when next time someone comes along and tells you AI is the future, useful to point out to them that actually AI is only the past. Generative AI, that's all it is. So I've talked about a bit what's wrong. I talked about why there's hope. Just a little bit of an outline, and I do believe that dialogue is much better than monologues, so I'm not going to talk for too long. I'd much rather talk about the kind of things that you'd like to talk about. But it's perhaps worth talking a little bit about in terms of Change Everything, what I see as the foundations of building rethinking. And one of the first foundations is universal basic income. And that's what the first chapter is about. And that's not actually saying that UBI in itself is what transforms things. What's transformative about UBI is it frees up an enormous amount of human energy, human time, human potential for people to decide for themselves how to spend their time, energy, and talents. And I go through in the book my sort of journey of how I started off with UBI as a human right, because nearly everyone will agree there's a human right to life. But a great many people in our society at the moment can't guarantee to be able to put food on the table, whether it's minimum hours, 0 hours contracts, minimum wage that's not enough money to live on, benefit sanctions that leave people with no money at all, the 2-child benefit cap, etc., etc. We're not actually guaranteeing people the right to life. They have to rely on food banks to guarantee the right to guarantee them the ability to literally eat and therefore live. And I'm of the view that we shouldn't rest until the last food bank closes because of lack of demand. So that's where I sort of started with UBI. But it was actually talking to a 17-year-old climate activist and universal basic income activist from Poland, who's one of the most amazing people I've ever met, because boy, was he taking on some tough challenges at the age of 17. But he was asking me, how do I campaign for universal basic income in a post-socialist society that's very suspicious of anything that's seen to be coming from the state. And I said, the first thing I said to him was, universal basic income is a right. You're guaranteed that right. And he said, yeah, but it's still coming from the state and that doesn't help people. And it was talking to him that I gradually realized that why UBI is so utterly transformatory, because in a universal basic income society, most of us now, unless you're perhaps retired or independently wealthy, have a boss who decides how we spend most of our time, energy, and talents. And we know there's lots of people using most of their time, energy, and talents doing either terribly destructive things or just absolutely horrible things, working in a horrible call center where every call has to be finished in 54 seconds and you're timed when you go to the loo. People are beaten down, they're made thoroughly miserable. Whereas if you have a universal basic income, people decide how to spend their time, energy, and talents. And I think we're going to see, and we need to see, a huge turnaround in political discussion. We still have the largest political forces talking about, we've got to create jobs. How do we create jobs? And they talk about decent jobs. So we've got to get people out of being street sweepers and get people out of being bus drivers and get them into better jobs. Except, of course, we desperately need the street sweepers and the bus drivers and the school dinner ladies and all of the other things that people do that are regarded as unskilled, quote unquote, job. And I don't think there's actually a job in this country that should be described as unskilled. But people are not choosing how to spend their time, energy, and talents. And, we are short 100,000 care workers. We're short 50,000 nurses. Most places you go along the high street and there'll be help wanted signs everywhere. They can't get HGV drivers for love nor money. We have to think of human resource as a scarce resource, like all of our other scarce resources, that have to be used well and put towards tackling the so many crises, the polycrises that we face. And the best way to do that is not a boss, as in we have under our current system. It's not under the old socialist system, the state that decides how you spend your time, energy, and talents. I believe in human potential, human creativity, human possibility. And I think that if we free up people to decide how to spend their own time and energy and talents, that's the best way to tackle all of the crises that are facing us. And that kind of related to that is my second chapter is about education. I talked about university tuition fees, but the problems start well before that. We've got schools that have been forced to become exam factories where pupils are shoved through exam after exam after exam. And I've visited I visit quite a lot of schools, and I've visited some schools that are horrifyingly like the most hideous military academy you could possibly imagine in terms of the way the pupils are treated. I went to a school in Hackney where, and we're talking secondary school here, the pupils have to walk down the corridor in silence, in single file. If they get caught speaking, they will get a detention. If they haven't got the right coloured pens with them that day, they will get a detention. They essentially every day have to write in the book what they've failed at, as well as what they've achieved. It's just the most horrifying education system that's basically still based on the Victorian models. You think about if what a schoolroom looks like, a school day looks like, a school curriculum look like today. We might have whiteboards and tablets, but the curriculum, the approach, the hours, the whole way people progress in year groups, etc., all of that would be perfectly recognizable to a Victorian schoolmistress. So we need to transform our education system so it prepares people for life, not just exams. And that means things like, I'm very passionate about first aid. There may be many of us in our life where first aid is the most important thing we could possibly know. Growing food, cooking food, making things. Most of our schools just don't teach these things anymore. Creating things, we've lost all of our creative subjects, drama and music and everything else. So we need to bring back that education for life, not just exams. And then the final chapter of the initial section, which is sort of setting out the framework for a society that works, has to be democracy. And I sometimes say that if you come and ask me to talk about algae, I will actually end up talking about democracy, because I think that human capability, human possibility, it's actually all of us collectively getting together and making decisions together. And I'm sure many people in this meeting know about the Climate Assembly held in the UK, also held in France, been held in lots of local areas. And my case study for this is the French one, because it's such a nice, clear case study. It came up with by saying that they should ban all flights where the train journey was less than 4.5 hours. And the government, probably nobbled by the airline industry, going, oh, we don't want to upset people too much, actually settled for 2.5 hours, which was kind of, I've actually seen some figures, and there is some stats that show that that has made some mild, modest improvement, but how much more improvement there would have been had it been 4.5 hours. So I believe in democracy. And anyone who follows me on Twitter will know that I regularly tweet that democracy, it would be a good idea. I'm sure most people on this call know that Sir Keir Starmer has now got 100% of the power in the House of Commons. And in fact, certainly for a couple of years, the House of Lords is not going to stand in front of him on anything. So Sir Keir Starmer now has 100% of the power with the backing of 34% of people who voted, which is about 25% of the people who are registered to vote, which is, if you then count in the fact of the missing millions, there's about 8 million people who aren't on the electoral roll who should be. We have about a 20% government. And I once did a event in Sheffield against a visiting professor called Brennan, who had a book called Against Democracy. And his thesis was that democracy, looking at the US and the UK, democracy hadn't worked. So what we really needed to try was some sort of meritocracy. So the only people who have a say in anything would be the people who've got a master's degree, i.e. people like him would decide how the world works. And I got up and suggested that before we gave up on democracy, perhaps we should try it. And neither the US or the UK were a democracy. And I think in academic terms, there was kind of quite a bit of blood on the floor by the end of that session, in metaphorical sense. But those things. And now I might be surprising you. I'm going to finish in a second and come to Q&A. So I'll warn people in advance that I'm coming to the end and look forward to taking questions. You might be surprised that I haven't talked about solar panels and insulation and electric buses and all those sorts of things. But I would say that of course, we need all of those kind of things. But what we need most of all is social innovation. Lots of people, the very idea of green growth, and we know you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. The very idea of green growth is you have business as usual with added technology. We can't have that. When you look at the Committee on Climate Change in the UK, the IPCC internationally, one of the reasons why they really struggle to make their numbers add up going towards 2050, why they're putting in increasingly massive and quite ridiculous figures for carbon capture and storage, for technological inventions that don't exist yet that are going to miraculously rescue us, is because they're assuming our society is going to continue on much the way as it is now. And what we need to do, and I think we need to get the idea out more, the Green Party has always said that economic and environmental justice are indivisible. There's enough resources on this planet for everyone to have a decent life, for us to look after climate and nature and get back within all the other planetary boundaries if we share those resources out fairly among the people on this planet. But of course, both the Committee on Climate Change and the IPCC can't do politics. They're only supposed to be doing the science. But what we need is social innovation, changing our politics, changing the way we organize our society. And things like the 4-day working week as standard, and New Economics Foundation a few years ago did a lot of work on a 3-day working week as standard with no loss of pay. We think about that both obviously saves travel, it saves work wardrobes, it saves emissions, it saves environmental impacts in an obvious kind of way. But again, it also frees up people to have the time to work on the problems in their community, the problems in their society. So the question is, how do we change? The answer is we think differently. We get together. We have a genuine democracy. And just a final thought that I'm going to finish on is if there's any creatives on this call or creatives, I have a slightly tongue-in-cheek little lecture that goes, okay, I want no more zombie movies, no more apocalypse novels. What I want to do is have a Hollywood rom-com. Boy meets boy, boy loses boy, boy gets boy back again. Set 30 years in the future, where just everything's worked out. And this isn't a political movie. It's not a movie that people who are politicians go and see. It's a Hollywood rom-com that, all the teenagers go and see as a date movie and all the rest of it. But in the background, we've just got the problems worked out. And if we think about doing things like that, painting the pictures, and that's what I think we all have to do, is not just talk about the different technology, not just talk about the politics, but say it is possible. And you, whoever the person you're talking to, you are part of the solution. Whoever it is, whatever they do, they can make a difference, but they can only make a difference when they get together with other people. I'm not interested in individual behavior. It's great if you as an individual do whatever you can. But what we have to do is change the system. So the most environmentally friendly and socially responsible thing to do is the easiest, cheapest, and simplest thing to do, the thing that everyone's just going to naturally do. And that, I'm sure many people on this call have marched down a road chanting system change, not climate change. And that system change is what we have to do. Not focus on individual behavior and not wave our finger at people, but acknowledge that many people now have no alternative but to do destructive things. Let's give them the better alternative and make it the natural alternative. So I'll stop there and follow my own directions of saying dialogue's better than monologue, and hand over to find out what you'd like to ask me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Natalie. That's incredible. We've journeyed a lot of places there. So folks, if you've got a question or a comment or some feedback, there is down the bottom, there's a little reactions tab like that, and you can raise a hand so we can see who wanted to go 1, 2, 3 or whatever it is. I'll just take Natalie off spotlight a sec. So yeah, I mean, so much in there really. You're saying about the current system is broken is one of the things we say, and system change, not climate change. There's a War on Want flyer I picked up at the Green Gathering. It says system isn't crossed out broken. It says it's rigged. And, we need system change. And what does it actually look like? Your last comments there. Got a few more bits there, but some questions coming up. So let's just take Natalie off spotlight so we can see a little bit easier. So Joanna, over to Joanna. First question, over, or comment, feedback, over.
Yeah, just a quick question, Natalie. You mentioned about Keir Starmer's got all the power now and won't come up in front of the House of Lords for, was it 2 years, you said? Could you explain that? I didn't understand it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, basically, it's a practical explanation, not a constitutional one. I've been in since the election, been in the House a bit and listening to the Tories and speaking to Tories, and they basically hold the line, and they never had a majority in the House, but with Labour, if Labour passes a bill, does something, you would need all the Tories to come together with the crossbenchers and all the other opposition parties to defeat the government. And basically the Tories are saying they are not going to do that for anything that's in the manifesto or anything in the foreseeable future. So there is simply not the numbers in the House of Lords. We can question, we can challenge, but we won't. The previous House of Lords was defeating the government very regularly on things like the horrendous Rwanda Bill, now Act, etc. There is just not going to be the will in the House of Lords to actually seriously take on the government. We'll scrutinise the legislation, we'll ask questions, we'll put down small amendments to change things, but I'll be very surprised if we see. There might be a question about reform of the House of Lords, which is a bit of a special case, but outside that, I don't think we'll see a defeat of the government in the House of Lords for some years.
Can I just add to that? Does that make you feel as though your role is very different then, or will be very different over the next few years?
Very much so. I mean, I think it's interesting. I've never done a job for more than 5 years, and I'm coming up to 5 years in the House of Lords. And I did kind of think when I started, I've given myself a life sentence, as in a prison sentence. But it is actually now so different, that it's going to be like starting again. I spent most of my time trying to stop the government doing things, and sometimes at a very marginal level, actually succeeding in doing that. I spent the time saying what the government's doing is absolutely dreadful. What I'm now going to be doing is something different, which is, okay, the government's doing something, but it's not nearly enough, or maybe they're not understanding things. And just as a case study of this, I'm going to have a piece in the I News tomorrow, which is just a small, but for some people, life and death issue. There's a disease called silicosis. Now, Australia has banned engineered stone, also known as quartz, kitchen worktops, bathroom worktops. Australia about a year ago banned them because 1 in 4 stonemasons in Australia has silicosis, and lots of them will die of it or have been severely disabled by it. I asked the previous government to do something about this. They said, no, it's fine. The health and safety executive's looking after all of this. I asked the new government, and I got an answer yesterday from the government saying basically, no, it's all fine. The health and safety executive's looking after this. You might have seen today, there are stories out in most of the papers saying they've identified the first 8 serious cases in the UK, and the doctors think it's just the tip of an iceberg. And so I've actually written a letter to Baroness Sherlock, who I actually really relate, who's our work and pensions minister, saying you've got to challenge the health and safety executive more. You are not, you can't just listen to and believe what they say. I know you've only been in for a month. I'm not going to wave my finger as I did at the previous government and say you're being crap, you're being terrible. I'm going to constructively say, well, I think you really need to look at this again. So it's a different kind of role. It's going to be a very, very different job. And I think we still haven't really worked out, we're at the very start of the whole shakedown. So it's going to be, a year or two before we've all worked out really our new roles and how they work. But I think for us as Greens, the frame is very clear. It goes from criticising everything the government's doing to trying to lead them, sometimes quite gently, into a direction of doing things a bit better. And that's a different kind of job.
Okay, we've got a few more questions coming up there. Hope that helps, Fiona. George, and then Nick, then Sean. I think Fiona jumped in there just after Nick, possibly, on a question on the chat. George.
Me?
Yes.
Right. You're on.
No, we can't hear you now, George. We could, but we can't now.
Are you sure? You should be able to.
We can hear you now. Go ahead.
Yeah. In the problem with the House of Commons is because he's got such a huge majority, can't make much of a stink because he's got the huge majority.
George, we're losing the last half, so say again. We got that first bit. He's got a large majority. No, your microphone's not working, George.
I can answer that.
Answer the first bit. I think we'll have to move on there if he's got technical issues. That was a brilliant sum up you put about the percentages of people, Natalie. Do you want to answer the first bit there?
Sure. I think, where we are now is profoundly unstable. And a lot of people were saying, before, perhaps a bit less afterwards, but certainly before the election, Labour gets an enormous giant majority, and that's 10 years of stable Labour government. Now, I think anyone who thinks that stability is suddenly going to break out in British politics really hasn't been paying attention for the last 10 years. Because when I was elected Green Party leader in 2012, I was saying then the future of politics doesn't look like the past. And I couldn't have, in 2012, have predicted, a Brexit referendum wasn't even on the agenda in 2012. I couldn't have predicted we'd have 3 Tory prime ministers in a couple of months. Lots and lots of things that have happened in the last 10 years would have been, if you'd written a novel saying those things had happened, commentators would just say, you've just gone crazy and wacky and totally surreal. So I think the idea we're suddenly going to see 10 years of a stable Labour government, I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I don't think the House of Commons is going to be or remain stable. I think it's going to be profoundly unstable. So, what exactly that looks like, how that will play out, I can't predict. One of the interesting things that perhaps we can learn some lessons from is look at what's happening in local councils and local government levels. And if you take, for example, Lancaster City Council, it had quite a large Labour majority, and then the Labour Party split into 3. And we, until recently, had a Green leader of the council she had, I think, 6 parties or groups part of the administration. But I don't think we're going to see stability continuing. I mean, I think there's a real problem. I mean, and this is, the whole points that I make about a democracy would be a good idea. We have a uncodified or unwritten, if you prefer, constitution accreted by centuries of historical accident. It doesn't work. Even utterly mainstream conventional people will tell you that the House of Commons hasn't worked for the last 10 years. The House of Commons is not suddenly going to start working now. And so that is, again, throwing everything up in the air constitutionally in terms of the framework, in terms of the system. So, I don't think we're going to see this pattern of 10 years of, gradually reducing Labour majority. It's going to be much more unstable than that.
Okay, very good answers coming back. Nick Rosen of Off Grid author.
Thanks, Phoenix. Hi, Natalie. Thank you for that.
Hi.
It's sort of both inspiring and painful to think how far we've got to go still. Anyway, we've got to make the first steps, and that's what my question's about. We all agree change is necessary. We all agree change is necessary. Social change is required in order to halt climate change. But the question is, what change? We can't answer that question. You could have hundreds of citizens' assemblies and still not answer that question. So I've got a better question. Where do we start? Where do we start with the change? And I've got a suggestion. It is with energy. Change Britain's energy and we can change Britain. That's my deep belief. And I wanted to ask if you have had time to consider Great British Energy with their plans to just fund big business, to do more big stuff. And is there any chance we can work together to try and introduce small-scale renewable energy on a large scale, particularly for housing, which this government says they so badly need? We all know perfectly well all the new electricity is going to go to data centres and EVs. There are housing projects stalled for 10 years, a £7 million renewal. I really think that the way to start this change is to change the energy system via small-scale renewables. Please comment.
I would agree that what you're suggesting, and it's something I've spent a lot of my time in the House of Lords and elsewhere advocating, is an absolutely necessary condition for change. Where I would perhaps disagree with you is I don't think it's anything like a sufficient condition for change. And it's interesting, actually, that, the House of Lords, that very weird, my one-word explanation of the House of Lords is it's a very weird place. But actually, in the last Energy Bill Now Act, the House of Lords actually ping-ponged several times the amendment that would have created support for local community energy schemes. And so we fought the House of Commons, the last government, quite hard in getting that provision into the last Energy Bill. Ultimately, and this is the reason why the House of Lords ultimately, we need to replace it with an elected house. Ultimately, people went, oh, we're the unelected house, so we can't stand up against the will of the elected house, so therefore we're not going to keep holding the line on community energy, as the same thing was said, for example, on the Rwanda Bill Now Act. And so I think community energy is very much fundamental. And I think you're absolutely right in identifying the problem with GB Energy, Great British Energy. Oof, I wince every time I say that phrase. But I think
Great Big Energy, it should stand for. Great
Yes,
Big Energy.
Great Big Energy. You're right. I might borrow that. Thank you. But I think in some ways, what's more foundational, and the book goes into this a little. There's a chapter on finance. And I've been thinking more about this, and I am, for my many sins, writing another book, which I'm supposed to finish by January. 100,000 words for Routledge. Let me say that really quickly. The City of London, the financial sector, the dominance of that across our society is, if we're looking at fundamental things that have to be tackled and have to change. I cite in Change Everything, and I'd really recommend, there's a wonderful little book called Imperial Mud, and it's actually written by an Australian historian, and it talks about how the City of London essentially colonised the fenlands of East Anglia, and it was the last part of England that had a really separate culture, that had a dialect that was essentially unintelligible to the rest of the country, that had a style of life that had very little involvement with money, but people actually got everything they needed from the wetlands. And those wetlands were an incredibly rich environment that gave people lots of things and was brilliant for nature. And the City of London funded Dutch drainage engineers. And the people in the Fenlands actually fought. You know, there were literally pitched battles. Not many people were killed, but there was some, and there's some really funny, great stories in the book about how the people tried to fight off. They had to ship in labourers from Manchester and Liverpool because the locals wouldn't do the work. But eventually, of course, the City of London won. And if you look at what the Fenlands look like now, they're the most awful biological desert of sugar beet fields and the like. And so I think, you know, tackling the City of London, tackling the financial sector, and I think that's something in which we've made some real progress in the last few years.
A lot of people have tried that, Natalie. It's sort of starting at the top, but can't we start somewhere more achievable?
I think, I mean, I've seen some real progress in tackling the financial sector in the last few years, because when I first went into the House 4 or 5 years ago, I talked about the corruption of the City of London. I talked about the, you know, the issue of which it funds so many dictators and so much corruption around the world. And, you know, people went scoff, 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 scoff. And then Russia invaded Ukraine. And suddenly the role of the oligarchs, the position of all that Russian money and Chinese money, and, you know, people worrying about China invading Taiwan, all of those things, there's been a real shift. And in fact, under the last government, the Tory government, there was a government minister came out and acknowledged that 40% of the world's dirty money, and now the IMF says 5% of global GDP goes in corruption. 40% of that goes through the City of London and British Crown dependencies. So there are some real vulnerabilities that we can work at in that area, that I would say is, you know, I'm not disagreeing with you about community energy or the energy system, but I think we have to go back, you know, what funds all those big companies is the city.
I think Occupy was saying similar, actually, and I think Mark Carney, Governor of Bank of England, after Occupy, said Occupy was actually right on a lot of things, you know, bailing out the big banks. And there's another book, I think it was called Pirate Islands or something. It was about all the tax havens that were set up and how much money is funneled through them. I hope that helps.
Can I just make one last point?
Go on,
Very briefly. I wrote an article called How Occupy Saved Wall Street in The Spectator. And it was a very detailed historical article which reminded people that it used to be called Occupy Wall Street, but then a load of people flooded into it, and guess what? It became Occupy the Rich. And that's what saved Wall Street, because the people who were really angry with Wall Street back in 2008 was the rich. They'd had most to lose. And I think those infiltrators got inside Occupy and they widened it out and changed the agenda. But sorry, I just wanted to say thank you again for the work on community energy in the House of Lords. Cheers.
Could you find a copy of that link and put it into the chat? I see B's got a hand up. I'm just going to very quickly say, on the first day of Occupy, we had 800 cities, 900 cities occupied having people's assemblies. That was a horizontal, bottom-up, getting involved with politics. Sean, thank you for waiting. Sean, then Helen.
Yes. Hi, Natalie. Thanks very much for the talk. Very, very encouraging. And I obviously agree with everything you said about UBI. And although I guess a level of frustration because there's been UBI sort of trials done since the late 70s. Our current government is still hell-bent on economic growth, which that's a fundamental problem, isn't it? If we don't change the economic model, we're doomed because we can only pay for what we spend today by tomorrow's growth. So unless we change that, how I admire your confidence in things might start to change, but how are they going to change when government after government is just hell-bent on this economic model that it just doesn't work?
Well, how are things going to change? I mean, I think I come back to the rethinking point. And one of the things last year in Brussels, there was a post-growth conference, which was actually held in the chamber of the European Parliament. And there was many of the names that many people on this call will recognise, from Jason Hickel to Kate Raworth, many others who were there. and it was actually held in the chamber of the European Parliament. It was sponsored by all of the political parties except the far right, the groupings in the European Parliament. I don't think lots of them actually really quite understood what they were sponsoring, to be honest. We did get the head of the European Commission got herself booed when she started talking about green growth. But nonetheless, there's a huge groundswell of thinking of different approaches, of different ways of doing things being developed. Tim Jackson, author of Prosperity Without Growth, was someone else who was there. And so if you think about neoliberalism, and I'm not a sort of conspiracy theorist, but you look at the history of neoliberalism, they started after the Second World War, and they ratcheted around holding conferences, writing books, writing reports. Okay, they had more money behind us than we have, but nonetheless, they looked a lot like us in terms of structure, in terms of being around the edges of not being regarded as the mainstream of politics. And then they broke through. And, you know, political change doesn't happen slowly and gradually. It happens in big jumps. And so that's where I very much believe that where we are now is profoundly unstable, and people are looking for something different. And, you know, centrist politics is dead, because centrist politics means leaving things much as they are now. What's going to happen is that either we're going to win, us broadly defined, the people who know there's enough resources on this planet to look after everything if we share them out fairly, or the far right is the other side. They're the people who say, oh, it's a difficult, dangerous world. We've got to grab what we can for us and ours, shove those others away, whoever those others are, build walls to keep them out. And politics is going to come down to between those two. You know, people say, oh, it's terrible, politics is only extremes now, but that's because the center is dead. And people sometimes ask you, you know, how do you know you're going to win? And I don't know that we're going to win. But what I know is that history is not pre-written, but made by the actions of people. And so, you know, it's in our hands what we've got to do. And the emotion of the other side, the far right, is fear. Our emotion, the foundational thing, has to be the hope, the understanding that this is possible, that change is possible. And you know, people forget how fast things have changed. I mean, I can remember I was born in 1966. And as a young child, I was in a world where virtually no women in a sort of anything from upper working class to middle class worked. My mother talked about herself as just a housewife. And that was the last remnants of the old social democratic consensus that thought that you had a family wage. One man usually would earn enough money to support a wife and a couple of kids. Even in a humble job like being a postman in London or something, you would use that single salary to buy a house. That was normal mainstream politics. And then everything changed. And so political change, social change is actually the normal human condition. And it happens really fast.
Very, very interesting points. Helen from everyone, and Natalie there. Helen and then Fiona.
Yeah, just a few thoughts going around. One of them is, ever since I got involved in anti-fracking and found out about all the sort of people like there are on this call, I keep hearing we need to change the narrative, and also things like degrowth and whatever. And it's always in little chunks, an hour or two. And somehow we need to sit for a week, a month, and really, really work through it all. I'm sort of just listening to a few things. Universal basic income, 4 day a week. If that's all we push for, what we leave is 3 days for people to consume, to get in their cars and drive to Brighton for the weekends, every weekend, to go trailing. I mean, I live near a shopping mall, and there's the same families trailing around it week after week, buying crap from Primark. So doing one without working on the other, we're not going to solve the problems. And then just another little thought. Mm-hmm. I actually met my future MP on my doorstep, and I told him I was lending him my vote. because I didn't like my lady MP who has one finger that she sticks in the air. So although I would like to vote Green, I couldn't. I had to get rid of her. But is it worth now all of us going back? And I think a lot of people lent the Labour person their vote to get someone out. Do we all now go back to them and say, right, you know I lent you that vote. I'm not doing it again. If you don't do the right things, I'm voting Green, whatever.
Two things. I mean, this book is an attempt, and it's basically a product of about 12 years of my going around the country doing public meetings, talking to groups of people to varying degrees, like the audience I've got tonight. I mean, you know, perhaps the other extreme of this was the Women's Institute in Sefton Park, a posh area outside Liverpool, for example. But, you know, talking to all kinds of different groups of people. And one of the things that I say about this book is that it's co-created. It actually tells lots of stories that people told me. So, for example, a lot of what I talk about universal basic income is influenced by a retired guy in Barnsley, who, after I talked about UBI, got up and said, well, you know, I retired a couple of years ago and now I look after the grandkids on Monday and Thursday, and on Tuesday I run the Men in Sheds group, and on Friday I run the Allotment Society, and on whatever. I don't know how I ever found time to work, to do paid work. And so this is the product of a dozen years of going around the country trying to paint that picture for people. You know, fiction is not my thing. Creative, I can't paint or draw to save my life. This is my non-fiction attempt to paint that picture of that society. And one of the things, I think the story I'm pretty sure is in the book. Sorry, you forget, but I'm pretty sure it's in the book. Quite a few years ago now, when I was a boss of a staff member who had a real debt problem, and the debt problem was causing problems in her work. And so this staff member, basically every lunchtime, she'd go out and go shopping and come back with a couple of new T-shirts or a new pair of shoes or a new whatever. And when we all said, what did you do at the weekend? She would say she went shopping. And so I sat her down, and, you know, I had the excuse of doing this because I was counseling her as a boss, and said, you know, maybe you could think about doing something else other than going shopping. And she was quite young, you know, sort of mid-late-ish 20s. And she couldn't think of anything else she could do with her spare time except go shopping. And that's a fundamental failure of our education system. And that's an education system that's focused on getting people through exams, getting them a job, that hasn't taught them things like growing food and making things and theatre and drama and all those kinds of different sorts of things. So that's why, you know, I think the education system is why it's in the first 3 chapters, and an essential part of the thing is we have to give people different frames. Although one other thing I'll say, sorry, this is rather a long answer, but is many people consume because they feel so insecure. You know, if you're, let's say, you know, a young lawyer or a young consultant in a city firm, you're supposed to lean on the water cooler and casually say, well, you know, when I went my long weekend in Dubai and I saw this and I bought that. And if you're not seen as a getting ahead person consuming like that, then there's very high likelihood you'll slide off the bottom and you know, get sacked the next time they sack the bottom 10% of people. And so there's so much pressure on people to consume for many different reasons. So that's my answer to the sort of the consumption question. And the second, technical voting. Many people have been talking about tactical voting for a long while. During this election, we started talking about strategic voting. Tactical is the short-term measure that you deal with a particular situation. Strategy is the long-term way that you change things. And lots of people don't know that every Green vote is actually getting us more short money. So that's more money to fund our MPs working in Parliament. Every Green vote, I mean, you've probably already seen this, places like the BBC and the ITV are giving us more coverage because we got so many votes in this election. So I would urge everybody to vote strategically. People have been voting tactically for a long time, and this is where it's got them. And I'm not saying don't go along and challenge your new Labour MP, but, you know, remember that there is the Labour whip, and the largest parties all have a whip, and MPs will only ultimately do what they're told. And one of the things that I think is really foundational about the Green Party is we don't have a whip. We allow people to have essentially every vote as a conscience vote. And that's not the position that other MPs are in. Thanks.
That's a really good answer. Can I just technical point here, folks, and Natalie, it's not often we get someone of your caliber to be able to chat to. Are you okay to roll on till 5 past or 10 past? 10 past?
No problems.
Brilliant. Okay, so folks, we'll roll on till 10 past. That. So Natalie, just 2 or 3 more questions. I think Fiona's got one there. I had a little something to pop in from the history of activism, and then John, and big up there from Sujal. Fiona.
Hi, Natalie. Yeah, I just wanted to bring us back to the energy transition, take it up where Nick Rosen left off. I just wanted to know what the Green Party's view on fossil hydrogen, blue hydrogen with carbon capture and storage is, and the subsidies the government has planned to support these projects. Because we don't seem to be on the right path, and that's of big concern. And what is the Green Party doing about lobbying against it?
It's a total fiction. That is no kind of environmental measure. Carbon capture and storage has never been operated successfully at scale. I haven't got it handy, but if you look at carbon capture and storage in my name in Hansard, you'll find me giving a very scathing speech or 6 or 9 months ago, just because the minister had the misfortune that it was actually the week that a whole lot of stats had come out about one of the biggest projects that's been put down in Canada, and it just has not technically worked. It hasn't stored nearly as much carbon as it said to have been going to store, and it's failed. And I've also been very big on, I mean, I don't really know where the current government is on this, but I think they're sort of in the right place. They were in opposition anyway. The whole issue of hydrogen does have a place, that is hydrogen from renewable sources when it's used as a way of storing when there's extra energy from the renewables, to use in hard to abate sectors, which might be long distance shipping, which might be, not sure, but it might be HGVs, might be steel making and cement making. But it has no place in any other usages except for those few hard to abate sectors. And carbon capture and storage is essentially a con. And just to sort of throw in the pair of that, the whole idea of offsetting, carbon offsetting, the whole idea of we'll plant trees, and that means we can keep burning fossil fuels, is a total con, just like carbon capture and storage is a total con. There's a huge mismatch between the timeframes in that you plant some trees and who knows where they'll be in 5, 10, 20, 100 years' time. You're taking carbon out of the ground that was put there hundreds of millions of years ago, and would remain there for hundreds of millions of years if you didn't dig it up. So absolutely opposed to the idea that carbon capture and storage has any place at all, and hydrogen has only a very limited place for very specific uses.
Okay, I think I was just in there before John and the hands up, and I saw B. So I'm just very briefly going to say a quick one, and then on to John and B. Just to say, we really have to envision the better future. Occupy had 900 cities working on horizontal people's assemblies. What we'd really like to see with the CEC network, there's 28 physical centres around the UK now, another 40 teams looking for buildings. For every one of them, every couple of months had a people's assembly in the building, but also out in the public park. And these were all digitally recorded, the decisions that were made by people. We could be linking up around the world and sharing this information horizontally. And there's a group called Time to Assemble that's working on that. I think they're in chat. Have a look, timetoassemble.org, and they're talking about a House of the People replacing the House of the Lords. So let's keep working on these ideas, folks. John and then B, and if we can keep things a little brief, folks, because we're on to John, then B.
Yes. Hello, Natalie, and thank you very much for being with us and sharing your thoughts with us. Now, I'll go back to a point which you made at the beginning, and that is, in fact, that you seem to think you gave a good impression of the Financial Times, and you are a strong supporter of UBI. I seem to recall that the Financial Times carried an article on UBI about 3 weeks ago. I don't know if you read it, but unfortunately, it was not terribly positive about the idea. And from what I recall, I don't recall all the details, but from what I recall, it's people in general would like very much to receive the payment, but according to the Financial Times, they're not very keen to pay the taxes which are necessary. I don't know what your view about that.
I do know the article you mean. I mean, it's worth saying first of all about the FT, and I'm not advocating for everything that runs in the FT. I just think they're and they have different commentators taking different positions on these things, the whole issue of where the money comes from is a very FT type question. But what I would say is, I mean, someone else made, I felt like making some reference to it, trials, is there's actually an amazing number of exciting trials happening around the country. One people may know about is with Welsh care leavers. And I think that's a great group in which to run a trial. And all the peer-reviewed research reports on this are not out yet because the trial isn't finished. But I've heard some anecdotal reports and some amazing reports about what it's achieving. Is that some of them, and stick with this story because it's a really telling story, is some of them gave up work in low-paid minimum wage jobs that would never take them anywhere, and they then went and got apprenticeships which didn't pay enough money to live on, but they used the UBI to supplement their apprenticeship pay so that they could actually get training, get skills, get a job that they would be able to really contribute to society with. Now, I think it's terribly telling that that should be the case, that you can't do an apprenticeship unless you've have to be lucky enough to be on a UBI trial, but nonetheless, that's where it is. And so, lots of these trials are happening around the country. Someone said, isn't it terrible? They're just doing trials. And I have to quote from BIAN, the Basic Income Earth Network, which is the global organization for UBI, which actually has got a conference coming up in Bath in a couple of weeks' time. I went to one of their events in Finland, and it was an Indian academic who said, well, we didn't trial the end of slavery, so why are we trialing UBI? Which I think is a very good question. But nonetheless, these trials are demonstrating that it works, that people are healthier and happier and actually are able to contribute more to society. And interestingly, I just retweeted Scott Sanson, who's a long-term UBI activist from America. And apparently the new vice presidential candidate just selected today has actually in his state presided over quite a number of trials of UBI, which is interesting. I don't know much more detail about that now, but it's certainly something to look into.
Okay, coming over to B very quickly. We're on the tail end of times here. Sorry, B. Yep, over.
Thank you. I just want to know the name of the book about the fens.
Imperial Mud. I think someone put a link in the chat. I saw a link in the chat go past.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. So what's to say, folks? I'll just say a little bit and then back to Natalie for final words and say goodbye. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight. And thank you so much to Natalie and to Jenny Jones and the other, warriors for the environment, Caroline Lucas, who have stood up for so much, for so many people for so long. And we really hope that our entire system begins to change with all of our help, that we can have a more horizontal system. I love what Natalie said about politics is something that people do rather than that is done to them. And when we were occupying Parliament Square for the People's Assembly of Parliament Square, otherwise known as Democracy Village, Tony Benn said, when we were having people's assemblies, this is the politics of the future, the politics of the street, people getting out and debating and discussing together. So let's hope we all create system change. Let's create that vision of what we want and actually make it happen together. Create that system change. Thank you so much, Natalie. Over to you for last words, and congratulations on the big success recently. And last words. Over. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, what you said might have been my last words, but I'll go for a different last word, which is where we are now is profoundly unstable. And I'll guarantee to you in 5 and 10 years' time, we will be in a very different place. And that's good news. And it's in all of our hands to shape what that place looks like. And we can all do it together. No one can do it as an individual. That's one of the other things that's different. The far right relies on one single leader, you know, usually a man, usually on a white horse, often in a military uniform, and people just follow him. We are all the people together collectively, and that's the foundation of our politics, is democracy.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. You're going to stop the recording there. Keep networking, folks. See you another week. Check out climateemergencycentre.co.uk.
Thanks, everyone.